What happens when a simple airline passenger in seat 13F reveals herself to be someone who commands the respect of the most elite fighter pilots in the world? This is the extraordinary true story of Colonel Sarah Phoenix Martinez, whose quiet flight home became a moment that would remind everyone aboard that heroes don't always wear their uniforms, and sometimes the most powerful people are sitting right next to you, unnoticed and unassuming. In an age where military service often goes unrecognized, and where the sacrifices of our servicemen and women fade into the background of civilian life, this story serves as a powerful reminder that extraordinary courage can be found in the most unexpected places. It's about respect earned through actions, not appearances, and how one radio call sign can bridge the gap between two different worlds of aviation. This is not just a story about airplanes or military protocol. It's about human dignity, the invisible bonds that connect those who serve, and how a single moment of recognition can restore faith in the values that truly matter. Prepare to discover how a routine commercial flight became an unforgettable lesson in honor, respect, and the unexpected ways our paths cross with greatness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac of Denver International Airport as passengers began boarding American Airlines Flight 1847 to San Antonio. Among them was a woman in her early 40s, dressed in simple jeans and a navy blue sweater, carrying nothing more than a small backpack and a worn leather jacket. She moved with purpose but without urgency, her short auburn hair catching the terminal's fluorescent lights as she made her way down the jet bridge. Sarah Martinez had specifically chosen seat 13F, a window seat toward the back of the aircraft. Most passengers avoided row 13 due to superstition, but Sarah had learned long ago that superstitions were luxuries she couldn't afford. She settled into her seat, stowing her backpack in the overhead compartment with practiced efficiency. The businessman in 13E barely glanced up from his laptop as she squeezed past him to reach the window. As the Boeing 737 filled with the usual mix of business travelers, families, and tourists, Sarah pulled out a paperback novel and opened it to a dog-eared page. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another passenger eager to reach her destination. There was nothing about her appearance that would suggest she was anything other than an ordinary traveler, perhaps a teacher returning from a conference, or a marketing executive heading to a client meeting. The flight attendants moved through their pre-flight routine with professional courtesy, barely acknowledging the quiet woman in 13F beyond the standard safety demonstration. Sarah nodded politely when the flight attendant pointed out the nearest exit, though she had already mentally mapped every emergency procedure the moment she boarded. Old habits, she thought to herself, never truly die. Captain Robert Chen, a veteran pilot with 23 years of commercial aviation experience, was completing his final checks in the cockpit. His first officer, Jennifer Walsh, was relatively new to the route but experienced enough to handle the straightforward flight to San Antonio. The weather was clear, the aircraft was in perfect condition, and the passenger manifest showed nothing unusual, just 147 souls heading southwest on what promised to be a routine Tuesday morning flight. As Flight 1847 pushed back from the gate, Sarah gazed out the window at the majestic Rocky Mountains in the distance. She had flown over these peaks countless times before, though never as a passenger. The view never got old, she reflected, whether you were seeing it through the canopy of an F-22 Raptor at 30,000 feet or through the small oval window of a commercial airliner. The takeoff was smooth, and as Denver fell away beneath them, Sarah allowed herself to relax for the first time in months. She was heading home after 3 weeks of meetings at Peterson Air Force Base, where she had been consulting on advanced fighter pilot training protocols. The meetings had been intense, filled with discussions about combat readiness, pilot psychology, and the evolving nature of aerial warfare. But now, as she settled into the comfortable anonymity of commercial travel, she could finally let her guard down. 30 minutes into the flight, as they reached their cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, an unusual situation began to develop. Captain Chen received an unexpected radio communication from air traffic control that would transform this routine flight into something extraordinary. American 1847, this is Denver Center. We have an unusual request. Can you confirm you have a passenger by the name of Sarah Martinez aboard your aircraft? Captain Chen exchanged a puzzled glance with his first officer. In his decades of flying, he had never received such a request. Denver Center, American 1847. We can confirm passenger names, but may I ask the nature of this inquiry? American 1847. We have two F-22 Raptors requesting permission to perform a flyby salute to honor one of your passengers. The pilots have identified someone they refer to as Phoenix aboard your flight. Do you have clearance to deviate slightly from your flight path for this honor? The cockpit fell silent for a moment. Both pilots stared at their radios in disbelief. F-22 Raptors, the most advanced fighter jets in the world, requesting to honor a passenger on their commercial flight? Captain Chen had heard of military flyovers for special occasions, but never for an individual passenger on a routine commercial flight.
First Officer Walsh, can you check the passenger manifest for a Sarah Martinez? Captain Chen asked, his voice betraying his confusion. Jennifer quickly scanned through the electronic passenger list. Yes, Captain. Sarah Martinez, seat 13F. Captain Chen made a decision that would create a moment none of the passengers would ever forget. Denver Center, American 1847. We confirm passenger Sarah Martinez aboard. We accept the flyby request. What are our instructions? Meanwhile, in seat 13F, Sarah continued reading her novel, unaware that two of her former squadron mates were approaching in their F-22 Raptors at high speed. Major Jake Viper Thompson and Major Lisa Hawk Rodriguez had been conducting training exercises when they spotted the commercial flight on their radar. When they cross-referenced the flight information and discovered that their former squadron leader was aboard, they couldn't resist the opportunity to pay their respects. Sarah Martinez, known by her call sign Phoenix, had been one of the most decorated F-22 pilots in the Air Force, before transitioning to a training and development role. She had earned her nickname during a particularly harrowing mission over hostile territory when her aircraft had been severely damaged by enemy fire. Despite losing most of her avionics and flying with a damaged engine, she had managed to complete her mission and return safely to base. Like the mythical Phoenix rising from ashes, she had emerged from what should have been certain destruction, stronger and more determined than ever. The two F-22 pilots approaching Flight 1847 had both served under Sarah's command during their early careers. She had been more than just their squadron leader. She had been their mentor, their inspiration, and in many ways the reason they had survived their most dangerous missions. The respect they held for her went beyond military hierarchy. It was the deep, unshakable respect that warriors reserve for those who have proven themselves in the crucible of combat. As the commercial airliner continued its steady course toward San Antonio, Captain Chen made an announcement that would puzzle most of the passengers, but would soon become crystal clear. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received an unusual and quite honestly unprecedented request from the Air Force. We're going to have a slight course adjustment to allow for a special flyby salute. Please remain seated and keep your window shades open. You're about to witness something truly extraordinary. The passengers murmured among themselves, some pulling out their phones to capture whatever was about to happen. The businessman in 13E finally looked up from his laptop, intrigued by the captain's mysterious announcement. Children pressed their faces to windows, scanning the sky for any sign of military aircraft. Sarah, however, felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She recognized the tone in the captain's voice, the specific way he had phrased the announcement. After years in military aviation, she could read between the lines. This wasn't a random flyby, or a routine training exercise that happened to coincide with their flight path. This was personal. She closed her book and looked out the window, her trained eyes scanning the sky with the methodical precision of someone who had spent thousands of hours in aerial combat. At first, she saw nothing but the endless expanse of blue sky and distant clouds. But then, barely visible against the horizon, she spotted them. Two F-22 Raptors flying in perfect formation, approaching from the east at incredible speed. Even from a distance, Sarah could tell these weren't just any pilots. The precision of their formation, the way they moved through the air with absolute confidence and control, told her these were elite pilots, the kind of aviators who had been forged in the same fires that had shaped her own career. As the fighters drew closer, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions washing over her. Pride in the magnificent aircraft and the skill of their pilots mixed with a deep nostalgia for the days when she had commanded such respect from the cockpit of her own Raptor. There was also a growing realization that somehow, some way, this moment was about her.
The two F-22s closed the distance quickly, their advanced engines allowing them to match the commercial airliner's speed effortlessly. As they took position on either side of Flight 1847, passengers throughout the cabin gasped in amazement. The sleek, angular fighters seemed to hang motionlessly in the air, their pilots maintaining perfect formation with the larger, slower commercial aircraft. Captain Chen's voice came over the intercom again, this time with a note of awe that he couldn't quite suppress. "Ladies and gentlemen, those are F-22 Raptor fighter jets, the most advanced air superiority fighters in the world. What you're witnessing is an extraordinary honor that I've never seen in my 23 years of commercial aviation." But the true surprise was yet to come. As passengers marveled at the sight of the military escort, Captain Chen received another radio transmission that would reveal the connection between the woman in seat 13F and the pilots who had come to honor her. "American 1847, this is Viper and Hawk. We'd like to request permission to speak directly with Phoenix if she's willing. She'll know what this means." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place for Captain Chen. Phoenix, the passenger named Sarah Martinez in seat 13F, the unprecedented flyby request. This quiet, unassuming woman in jeans and a sweater was somehow connected to these elite fighter pilots in a way that commanded their deepest respect. Sarah, still gazing out at the F-22s maintaining their perfect formation alongside the commercial flight, finally understood what was happening. She recognized the call signs Viper and Hawk, and she knew that these two pilots had gone to considerable effort and probably bent more than a few regulations to arrange this moment. The lump in her throat grew as she realized the magnitude of the gesture. Flight attendant Michelle Garcia, who had been serving passengers in the rear of the aircraft, approached row 13 with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. She had received instructions from the captain to locate Sarah Martinez and inform her that the Air Force pilots wished to speak with her. "Excuse me, are you Sarah Martinez?" Michelle asked quietly, leaning down toward the window seat. Sarah nodded, her eyes still fixed on the fighters outside her window. "Yes, I am. The captain has asked me to let you know that the Air Force pilots would like to speak with you directly if you're willing. They're calling for someone named Phoenix." For the first time since boarding, Sarah smiled a genuine, warm smile that transformed her entire appearance. The quiet, unassuming passenger seemed to straighten in her seat, and for just a moment, Michelle caught a glimpse of the commanding presence that had once led fighter squadrons into combat. "Please tell the captain that Phoenix is honored by their request and would be privileged to speak with Viper and Hawk." As Michelle made her way back to the front of the aircraft to relay the message, the passengers in the surrounding seats began to realize that something significant was happening. The woman they had barely noticed, who had been reading quietly in seat 13F, was somehow the reason for this extraordinary military escort. The businessman in 13E, whose name was David Richardson, found himself staring at Sarah with new curiosity. "I'm sorry, but are you connected to those fighter jets somehow?" Sarah turned to him, and he was struck by the intensity and intelligence in her eyes. "In a manner of speaking, yes. Those are two of the finest pilots I've ever had the honor of serving with. You served with them? Are you in the military?" "I was," Sarah replied simply. "For many years." As Captain Chen prepared to patch the radio communication through to the cabin so that Sarah could speak with the F-22 pilots, he couldn't help but feel that he was about to witness something historic. In all his years of flying, carrying hundreds of thousands of passengers to destinations around the world, he had never encountered a moment quite like this. The stage was set for a conversation that would reveal the extraordinary story of the woman in seat 13F. A conversation that would demonstrate the profound bonds forged between warriors who have faced danger together, and a moment that would remind everyone aboard Flight 1847 that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized and unacknowledged. As Sarah waited for the radio patch to be established, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a young woman with dreams of flying to one of the most respected fighter pilots in the Air Force, from commanding squadrons in combat to training the next generation of aviators, her path had been anything but conventional. And now, 37,000 feet above the American heartland, surrounded by civilians who had no idea of her background, She was about to reconnect with two pilots who represented the very best of everything she had worked to achieve. The quiet passenger in seat 13F was about to reveal herself as Phoenix, and in doing so, would create a moment of recognition, respect, and honor that none of the passengers would ever forget. Captain Chen's voice crackled over the cabin's public address system with an announcement that would forever change how the passengers viewed the woman in seat 13F. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to patch through a radio communication between our passenger Sarah Martinez and the F-22 pilots flying alongside us. This is an extraordinary honor, and I ask that you remain quiet so everyone can hear this historic exchange. The cabin fell into complete silence. Even the crying baby in row 8 seemed to sense the gravity of the moment and quieted down. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 146 pairs of eyes upon her. She had addressed Joint Chiefs of Staff, briefed senators on military strategy, and commanded respect in rooms filled with the most powerful people in the defense establishment. But somehow this moment felt different, more personal, more meaningful. The radio crackled to life, and a familiar voice filled the cabin. "Phoenix, this is Viper. It's an honor to fly alongside you again, even if you're not in your usual office." Sarah's voice, when she responded, carried a tone of authority and warmth that surprised many of the passengers. This was not the quiet woman who had been reading a paperback novel. This was a leader, a commander, someone accustomed to making life and death decisions at supersonic speeds. "Viper, Hawk, this is Phoenix. I have to say, this is the most creative escort mission I've ever been part of. Are you two still getting into trouble? Or have you learned to follow regulations since I left?" Laughter echoed through the radio, and Major Jake Thompson's voice came through clearly. "Ma'am, we learned everything we know about creative interpretation of regulations from the best. Hawk and I were conducting routine training exercises when we spotted your flight path. We couldn't let you pass through our airspace without proper honors." Major Lisa Rodriguez's voice joined the conversation. "Phoenix, Hawk here. We wanted to thank you properly for everything you taught us. Both Viper and I owe our lives to the training and leadership you provided. We've never had the chance to tell you that in an appropriate setting." The emotion in Hawk's voice was unmistakable, and several passengers found themselves wiping away tears without fully understanding why. There was something profound happening here, something that transcended the mechanics of flight and touched on deeper themes of mentorship, sacrifice, and respect. Sarah's response revealed the depth of her character and the reason she commanded such loyalty from her former subordinates. "Hawk, Viper, you don't owe me anything. You both became exceptional pilots because of your own dedication and skill. I was just privileged to be part of your journey. The honor has always been mine." David Richardson, the businessman in 13E, found himself completely absorbed in this exchange. Like many Americans, he had a theoretical appreciation for military service, but he had never had a window into the personal relationships and deep bonds that defined military culture. Listening to this conversation was like being granted access to a sacred ritual, a moment of recognition between warriors that civilians rarely witnessed. Captain Chen, who had been following the conversation from the cockpit, couldn't resist asking a question that had been burning in his mind since this extraordinary flyby began. "Phoenix, if I may ask, would you mind sharing with us what led to this remarkable display of respect from these F-22 pilots?" Sarah paused for a moment, glancing around the cabin at the faces of her fellow passengers. She saw curiosity, respect, and genuine interest in their expressions. These were ordinary Americans, people going about their daily lives, and they deserved to understand what this moment represented. "Captain, passengers of Flight 1847, I had the privilege of serving as a squadron leader in the F-22 program for several years. Viper and Hawk were both in my squadron during a deployment that tested all of us in ways we never expected. What you're witnessing today is their way of honoring not just me, but the bonds that are formed when people face danger together and learn to depend on each other completely. Phoenix, if you don't mind, I'd like to share something with your fellow passengers. Sarah Martinez, call sign Phoenix, is quite possibly the finest combat pilot the Air Force has ever produced. During our deployment in the Middle East, she led our squadron through 37 combat missions without losing a single pilot. That's unheard of in high-threat environments." The cabin remained silent, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Passengers who had been casually scrolling through their phones were now leaning forward, hanging on every word. The elderly woman in 12C clutched her husband's hand, tears streaming down her face as she began to understand the magnitude of the woman sitting just one row behind her. Major Rodriguez continued the story. What Viper isn't telling you is that Phoenix earned her call sign during our most dangerous mission. We were providing air support for a ground rescue operation that had gone wrong. Phoenix's aircraft took multiple hits from enemy surface-to-air missiles, but she refused to abort the mission because soldiers on the ground were depending on our support. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had never been comfortable with public recognition, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves. But she understood that Hawk and Viper needed to tell this story, needed to honor not just her but the values they all served. "The technical details aren't important," Sarah interjected, trying to redirect the conversation away from her individual actions. "What matters is that we all did our jobs. Every successful mission is a team effort, from the ground crews who maintain the aircraft to the intelligence officers who provide critical information, to the pilots who execute the mission. No one succeeds alone in military aviation." But Hawk wasn't finished. "Ma'am, with respect, our passengers need to understand what we're honoring here. After your aircraft was damaged, you had every reason to return to base. Your ejection seat was damaged, your backup systems were failing, and you were flying on pure skill and determination. But you stayed in the fight because people on the ground needed you. You saved 7 soldiers that day, Phoenix. 7 American soldiers who went home to their families because you refused to give up." The silence in the cabin was now profound. Flight attendant Michelle Garcia found herself crying openly as she stood in the galley, overwhelmed by the realization that she had served coffee to a genuine American hero without knowing it. Captain Chen, listening from the cockpit, felt a deep sense of privilege at being part of this moment. A voice came from the back of the plane. It belonged to Tom Williams, a retired Marine sergeant who was traveling with his grandson. "Ma'am, on behalf of everyone who has served, thank you for your sacrifice and your leadership. It's an honor to share this flight with you." Sarah turned in her seat to acknowledge Tom's words, and when she saw the Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm, she nodded with the subtle recognition that exists between service members. "The honor is mine, Sergeant. Thank you for your service." This exchange seemed to open floodgates. Other passengers began sharing their own connections to military service. A young woman in row 5 mentioned that her brother was currently deployed in Afghanistan. An elderly man in row 2 spoke about his father's service in World War II. What had begun as an unusual flyby was becoming a moment of national reflection and gratitude. Through it all, the 2 F-22 Raptors maintained their perfect formation alongside the commercial airliner. The precision required to match speeds with the much slower civilian aircraft while maintaining safe separation distances was a testament to the exceptional skill of both pilots. For passengers lucky enough to have window seats, the sight was breathtaking, a display of American military capability and professionalism that few civilians ever witness up close. Viper's voice came through the radio again, this time with a more personal tone. "Phoenix, I want to share something with everyone that demonstrates the kind of leader you were. During our deployment, you made it a point to know every person in our support crew by name. You knew about their families, their concerns, their career goals. You treated the 19-year-old airman who loaded our weapons with the same respect you showed the commanding general. That's the kind of leader that builds the strongest military in the world." Sarah felt the weight of these words, remembering the faces of all those young airmen and women who had kept her aircraft flying and her mission successful. Those young service members were the backbone of everything we accomplished. A pilot is only as good as the team supporting them, and we had the finest team the Air Force could assemble. As the conversation continued, passengers began to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple military courtesy. This was a masterclass in leadership, sacrifice, and the values that define American military service. Sarah Martinez, the quiet woman in seat 13F, represented something that many Americans rarely encounter directly, but depend on every day: the professional warrior class that stands ready to defend the nation's interests around the world. The young mother in row 7, traveling with her 2 children, asked a question that spoke to the concerns of many parents. "Phoenix, What would you want my children to understand about military service? What values should we be teaching them? Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. I'd want them to understand that freedom isn't free, but also that military service is about much more than warfare. It's about leadership, teamwork, personal excellence, and serving something larger than yourself. Whether they choose military service or civilian careers, those values will serve them well. One of the children, a boy of about 10, raised his hand as if he were in school. Are those the fastest airplanes in the world? Major Thompson answered with obvious pride. Young man, the F-22 Raptor is indeed one of the fastest and most advanced fighter aircraft ever built. But what makes them really special isn't their speed or their weapons systems. It's the pilots who fly them and the values they represent. The boy's eyes were wide with excitement. Are you like Top Gun pilots? Laughter filled the radio channel, and Hawk responded, well, we like to think we're even better than the Top Gun pilots. But Phoenix here could probably beat all of us in aerial combat. She's the real deal. Sarah smiled at the exchange, remembering her own childhood fascination with military aviation. You know, when I was about your age, I had the same questions about military pilots. I never imagined I'd actually become one. The most important thing is to dream big and work hard. You never know where that combination will take you. As the conversation continued, Captain Chen received word from air traffic control that the F-22s would need to break formation soon to return to their training exercise. The realization that this extraordinary moment was coming to an end seemed to settle over the entire aircraft. Phoenix, Viper said, his voice carrying a note of finality, we need to head back to base soon, but before we go, we want you to know that your influence extends far beyond the pilots you directly commanded. The training protocols you developed are still being used today. You're still saving lives, even from your new position. Viper Hawk, you've given me a gift today that I'll never forget. This conversation, this honor, this moment shared with these wonderful passengers, it's more meaningful than any medal or commendation I've ever received. Fly safe, stay sharp, and continue to make us all proud. The emotion in Sarah's voice was unmistakable, and there wasn't a dry eye in the cabin. Even the most cynical passengers found themselves moved by the genuine affection and mutual respect demonstrated by these three military professionals. Major Rodriguez's voice came through one final time. Ladies and gentlemen of Flight 1847, you're traveling with one of America's finest. Phoenix, we salute you, and we'll see you on the other side. As the two F-22 Raptors peeled away from the commercial airliner in perfect synchronization, their afterburners creating brief trails of fire against the blue sky, the passengers erupted in spontaneous applause. Sarah Martinez, the woman in seat 13F, found herself standing to acknowledge the appreciation of her fellow travelers, and for the first time since boarding, she allowed her military bearing to show through completely. But the story was far from over. As news of this extraordinary flyby began to spread through social media and news networks, Flight 1847 was becoming the center of a national conversation about military service, heroism, and the unsung heroes who walk among us every day. As the F-22 Raptors disappeared into the distance, their afterburner trails fading against the endless sky, the atmosphere inside Flight 1847 remained electric with emotion and newfound understanding. Sarah Martinez settled back into her seat, but the transformation was complete. The quiet, anonymous passenger in seat 13F had revealed herself to be Colonel Sarah Phoenix Martinez, and nothing would ever be the same. Captain Chen's voice came over the intercom, carrying a tone of genuine awe that he had never used in 23 years of commercial aviation. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been flying for over 2 decades, and I can honestly say that what we just experienced was extraordinary beyond anything I could have imagined. We've been honored to share our flight with a true American hero. David Richardson, the businessman in 13E, turned to Sarah with a completely different perspective than he had possessed just an hour earlier. Ma'am, I have to ask, do you mind if I shake your hand? I've never met anyone quite like you. Sarah smiled warmly and extended her hand. Please, call me Sarah. And thank you, David. But remember, There are thousands of men and women serving right now who deserve the same recognition. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time today." Their handshake was firm and respectful, but David wasn't satisfied with her modest response. "Sarah, with respect, I think you're underselling what we just witnessed. Those fighter pilots didn't arrange this flyby for someone who was just in the right place at the right time. They did this because you're exceptional." The conversation was overheard by passengers throughout the rear section of the aircraft, and soon Sarah found herself engaged in discussions with travelers from all walks of life. Tom Williams, the retired Marine sergeant, moved to an empty seat nearby to share stories of his own service. The young mother with 2 children asked thoughtful questions about leadership and courage. Even the previously crying baby seemed content, as if the positive energy in the cabin had created a sense of peace and security. Flight attendant Michelle Garcia approached Sarah with a request that would prove to be the beginning of something much larger than anyone could have anticipated. "Sarah, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but would you mind if I took a photo of you? My brother is currently deployed with the Army in Germany, and I think he'd be incredibly inspired by meeting you, even if it's just through a picture." Sarah agreed, and what followed was a steady stream of passengers wanting to meet her, shake her hand, and capture a moment with someone who represented the very best of American military service. She handled each interaction with grace and humility, always redirecting praise toward the broader military community and emphasizing the team nature of her accomplishments. Unknown to Sarah and the other passengers, word of the extraordinary flyby was already spreading far beyond the confines of Flight 1847. Several passengers had managed to capture video of the F-22s flying in formation with their commercial aircraft, and these videos were rapidly going viral on social media platforms. News outlets were picking up the story, and by the time Flight 1847 began its descent toward San Antonio, major networks were preparing to cover what was being called the most extraordinary display of military respect ever witnessed on a commercial flight. As the aircraft began its approach to San Antonio International Airport, Captain Chen received another unexpected communication from Air Traffic Control. "American 1847, this is San Antonio Tower. We've been following your flight situation, and we have authorization to offer you a water cannon salute upon landing, if your passenger Phoenix is agreeable. The airport fire department would be honored to participate in recognizing her service." Captain Chen looked at his first officer with amazement. In aviation, a water cannon salute is one of the highest honors that can be bestowed, typically reserved for the final flights of retiring pilots or other momentous occasions. For a passenger to receive such recognition was virtually unprecedented. "San Antonio Tower, American 1847. Let me check with our passenger." Captain Chen activated the intercom and explained the situation to Sarah and the other passengers. The cabin erupted in applause, and Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the continuing displays of respect and recognition. "Captain," Sarah responded, "please tell San Antonio Tower that Phoenix is deeply honored and grateful for their offer. I accept on behalf of all the men and women who serve." As Flight 1847 touched down on the San Antonio runway, 2 massive fire trucks flanked the taxiway and created towering arcs of water that the aircraft passed through like a triumphant procession. Passengers pressed their faces to windows, many recording the moment on their phones, understanding that they were part of something that would be remembered and talked about for years to come. But the surprises weren't over. As the aircraft pulled up to the gate, passengers could see through the terminal windows that a crowd had gathered. Word had spread quickly through the airport about the extraordinary passenger on Flight 1847, and airport employees, military personnel stationed in the area, and even some local news crews had assembled to witness Sarah's arrival. Sarah looked out at the gathering crowd and felt a mixture of gratitude and responsibility. She understood that this moment had grown far beyond her individual story. It had become a symbol of recognition for all military service members, a reminder to the American public of the sacrifices made by those in uniform, and an opportunity to bridge the gap between civilian and military communities that often exist in parallel without meaningful interaction. As passengers began deplaning, many stopped to thank Sarah personally and to express their newfound appreciation for military service. The young mother with 2 children introduced her son and daughter to Sarah, explaining that they had just met a real American hero. The 10-year-old boy who had asked about the F-22s shook Sarah's hand solemnly and told her he wanted to be a pilot when he grew up. Tom Williams, the retired Marine sergeant, was among the last to deplane. As he passed Sarah's row, he stopped and rendered a crisp military salute. "Colonel, it has been an honor to serve on the same flight with you. Semper Fi." Sarah stood and returned the salute with equal precision. "Semper Fi, Sergeant. Thank you for your service and sacrifice." Their exchange was captured by one of the passengers still recording, and the image of two service members, separated by different branches and generations, showing mutual respect, would become one of the most shared images from the entire event. When Sarah finally gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the aircraft, Captain Chen and First Officer Walsh were waiting for her at the entrance to the cockpit. Captain Chen extended his hand and spoke on behalf of the entire crew. "Colonel Martinez, it has been the greatest privilege of my career to have you aboard our aircraft today. You've reminded all of us about the values that make this country great, and you've given our passengers an experience they'll never forget." Sarah shook hands with both pilots and thanked the flight attendants who had facilitated the extraordinary radio communication with the F-22 pilots. "You all handled this situation with incredible professionalism and grace. Thank you for helping create such a special moment." As Sarah walked through the jet bridge toward the terminal, she could hear the crowd that had gathered to welcome her. Airport security personnel had established a controlled area where she could meet with some of the people who had come to show their respect, including several active-duty military personnel stationed at nearby Lackland Air Force Base. Among those waiting was Colonel James Murphy, the commanding officer of the 37th Training Wing at Lackland. "Colonel Martinez, I'm Jim Murphy. I've followed your career for years, and I wanted to personally thank you for your service and your continued contributions to Air Force training protocols. Would you have a few minutes to meet with some of our young airmen? They've heard about what happened on your flight, and they'd be honored to meet you." Sarah agreed immediately. Meeting with young service members and sharing her experiences had become one of her greatest passions since transitioning away from active flying duties. The group of airmen and women who had gathered represented the future of American air power, and Sarah understood the importance of connecting with them personally. As she spoke with the young airmen, answering their questions about leadership, combat flying, and career development, local news crews captured footage that would be broadcast across the country. But more importantly, she was able to impart lessons learned through years of experience to the next generation of military leaders. One young airman, barely 19 years old, asked a question that got to the heart of what the day had meant. "Ma'am, a lot of people don't really understand what we do or why we do it. How do you think what happened on your flight today might change that?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "I think what happened today showed that when civilians and military personnel truly connect, when they understand each other's perspectives and values, something beautiful happens." AM.H6 Do It Anyway. AM.H6. This is the book. It's about history. Those passengers on Flight 1847 didn't know they were flying with a military person, but when they learned about my background, they responded with respect and gratitude. At the same time, they taught me about the American people we serve, their genuine appreciation for sacrifice and service, and their desire to support those in uniform. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Sarah sharing insights about leadership, the importance of mentorship, and the evolving role of air power in national defense. But perhaps more importantly, she listened to the concerns and aspirations of these young service members, understanding that leadership is as much about learning from others as it is about imparting knowledge. As the impromptu gathering began to wind down, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary day that had begun with her boarding Flight 1847 as an anonymous passenger, and ended with her standing in an airport terminal, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by her story. But she also understood that the story was far bigger than her individual experience. In the days that followed, video footage from Flight 1847 would be viewed millions of times across social media platforms. News outlets would pick up the story, using it as a launching point for broader discussions about military service, civilian-military relations, and the sacrifices made by service members and their families. The hashtag Phoenix1347 would trend on social media, with people sharing their own stories of military service and thanking veterans for their sacrifices. Major Thompson and Major Rodriguez, the F-22 pilots who had initiated the extraordinary flyby, would be interviewed by multiple news outlets about their decision to honor their former commander. Their explanation would resonate with military and civilian audiences alike. Sometimes you encounter someone whose impact on your life and your profession is so profound that you must find a way to honor them properly. The passengers from Flight 1847 would stay in touch through social media, creating a unique bond forged by their shared experience. Many would become advocates for military causes, volunteering at veterans organizations and supporting military families. The 10-year-old boy who had been fascinated by the F-22s would indeed pursue his dream of becoming a pilot, eventually earning an appointment to the Air Force Academy years later. For Sarah Martinez, the experience reinforced her belief in the fundamental goodness of the American people and their appreciation for military service. It also demonstrated the power of authentic human connection to bridge divides and create understanding between different communities. As she finally left the airport and headed home to her family, Sarah carried with her not just memories of an extraordinary day, but a renewed sense of purpose. The recognition she had received was gratifying, but more importantly, the connections she had made with fellow passengers, young airmen, and the broader public reminded her why she had chosen a life of service in the first place. The quiet passenger in seat 13F had become Phoenix once again, not just for a few hours in the sky, but as a symbol of the values, sacrifice, and dedication that define American military service. Her story would continue to inspire others long after Flight 1847 had reached its destination, proving that sometimes the most powerful moments arise from the simplest circumstances, when ordinary people recognize extraordinary service and choose to honor it appropriately. The call sign Phoenix had indeed risen again, not from the ashes of combat, but from the recognition and respect of a grateful nation, demonstrated one passenger, one handshake, and one salute at a time.